Hello everyone, welcome back to the course Energy Resources, Economics and Sustainability. So in continuation to the last class, we'll be discussing some more applications or case studies where we'll see the application of both life cycle assessment and techno-economic analysis leading to making good decisions which can help the policymaker, decision makers take meaningful decisions for the future well-being of the society. In the past classes or in the course, we have learned many tools which pertain to techno-economic analysis and life cycle assessment, and this is what we will be utilizing. So one case study that we would be considering is that pertains to the northern part of the country, specifically the Himalayas. So in the Himalayas, we have a lot of pine trees, and the leaves of these trees, which are also called pine needles, often fall during the spring season in the months of April and May, and because of the dry climate, it is a very good atmosphere for them to catch fire, and they are one of the major reasons for forest fires that we experience in the states of Uttarakhand, Himachal and nearby areas. So not only does it have a huge effect on biodiversity, it also affects the people living nearby. So this case study was undertaken by a group where we wanted to see the sustainability if these pine needles could be used for electricity production. And on the land, there are many NGOs also working for these kinds of proposition, but we wanted to estimate the sustainability of such a process. So we can see here like the local administrator like have been putting in news articles where they have been putting in different orders of looking for measures to use this waste which is in terms of the pine needles available in plenty, and if they could be collected in a sustainable manner so as to prevent forest fires. The solution that has been proposed by the civic society, by the technical or the knowledgeable people has been like, can we use the local people or utilize the local people who are available there for collection of these pine needles, so it is a mode of generation of employment for them. And finally, after the collection, these pine needles could be used for electricity production. As you can see here, there is a gasifier that is working in a lab that is running on pine needles, and you can see electricity being generated. So it's a standalone system, 5 kilowatt system, and which is entirely running on biomass like pine needles, and it is generating electricity. So we wanted to look at the potential of these solution, and of course, since we would be avoiding pine needles forest fire, we would also be saving in the CO2 that would be emitted because of the forest fires. So as you can see, these are the forest fires that have taken place in the state of Uttarakhand, and you can see they have been highlighted, and the data has been taken it from a NASA satellite, and overall the CO2 equivalent emissions that might result from these forest fires are of the tune of around 58 into 10 to power 6 tons per year. So that's huge. So we wanted to do a life cycle assessment of this particular pathway, which again is following the ISO guidelines. It's a cradle to grave approach, means from the pioneer plantation to the electricity generation. We used a specialized software GABI. This is different from the software SIMAPRO which we have discussed in the previous classes. The function unit that we adopted was 1 kilowatt hour of electricity generation, and CML pathways were used for estimation of the emissions. So if I take about the pathway, this is the pathway was like pine needles or pine trees during its growth will be absorbing the CO2. Then you would need to collect and take it to storage 1, and this collection would have their own emissions. After the storage, the pine needles, because of the low density, needs to be densified or chipped in. So you would have the chopping process, because the typical size is almost 10 to 20 centimeters. You would want to chip it into smaller needles. And further, you can also work towards densification of these pine needles, because the bulk density is quite low, and the transportation that follows might be dictated by volume rather than weight. So it's always a good methodology to densify or maybe torify the pine needles that are available. Then you would transport it to a second storage where you would have the power generation using a process called gasification. In gasification, you would normally be heating a pine needles in an insufficient supply of air. The resulting would be a gas that is rich in hydrogen as well as carbon monoxide. So it has somewhat of a calorific value, which could be then used in a modified engine which could be producing electricity. One of the major bottlenecks of this process would be that the collection needs to happen within a short span of 3 months, whereas for the utilization would remain for an year or so. Further, we wanted to see the emission that can come from the transportation itself, because when we are looking at a mountainous terrains, the road network is not necessarily straight. There are long paths. Further, the elevation would be very different. That entails that the fuel economy for the different transportation vehicles, which could be different types of trucks, would be very different. So the first thing that we did was quantifying of the pine needles that are available in the different places. So this quantification was done using a software called Maptitude. Then their correlation was made with respect to connecting the supply points to where could be the different gasifiers that could be set up. So gasifier again is an equipment that would convert these pine needles into usable electricity, and they can come in different sizes. So the sizes that we looked at could vary from 25 kilowatt to 250 kilowatt. Of course, the larger plants would be benefiting from the economies of scale, but this might also entail a larger storage nearby, on some maybe a slightly larger transportation as well, and this is what we did with the help of the softwares. So this analysis was again done with the help of softwares and different coding, where we tried to see optimize the distance that was traveled by the different transportation vectors, as well as the foot transportation that would have to initially been taken by like the manual labor who would be collecting it. And we can see as the gasifier capacity would increase, that the transportation would slightly increase. And of course, this is how the road network for one particular district in Uttarakhand localized. So this was for Chamoli district. That this you can see that the roads are not straight. There are, you would have to take in considerably larger paths from reaching one point to another. And this network was set up for 6 different gasifiers if they were set up in that district. And based upon that, we created a network of LCA input in the Gabi software. So you see the network in front of you. So this was just to show you like how this particular system is different from the SIMA Pro one, which you have learned in the earlier classes. So herein you can have a good graphical user interface where you can see how the systems look like. So you have the pine needle growing in here, the transportation, you can see the diesel with specific to Indian production being here, the Indian specific electricity in here, the chopping here, again the secondary transportation, the power generation, and the emissions from the gasifiers coming in here. And then there was another model that was made in the same software. So first one was the pine needles are just chipped. In the second option, we are also bricketing the pine needles, which means we are densifying it so that the bulk density increases and the transportation comes down to a certain extent. And if I talk about the solution, this is what the total emissions would look like. The emissions would come from the exhaust of the gasifier, because we are burning biomass, and you would have CO2 and other kinds of oxides being formed in here. The pine plantation during in growth will take in CO2. During the storage, the biomass would degrade and could have different kinds of methane emissions. So that emissions could be significant here. Plus, if you are going for densification, that would require electricity as in here. So if I talk about the total emissions, they vary from around 0.5 to 0.6 kgs of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. And if I compare that with the current grid electricity, that is coming at around 0.8 or 0.9. So we're not saving much. So this is the current grid electricity, whereas this would be the biomass coming from 2 different scenarios. So we can see like even from a greener route, the CO2 emissions could be quite near to what the grid is supplying us. And further, a major understanding that we developed was all the transportation looks like to be a significant one, but for this particular case that we analyzed, the transportation emissions were not very significant as compared to that which were coming from the exhaust or the storage. So storage of biomass could be a serious concern, because during the storage period, the biomass would be emitting or degrading, and this decomposition normally leads to formation of methane. And like there are different studies with different methane emission factors, which you can see here. So there's a wide variation in that. Further, if I talk about the acidification and the eutrophication potential, we can see for the different cases. Of course, electricity that was used for different chopping and bricketing purposes to be a major contributor for this total acidification and eutrophication that was coming in. And compared to the grid-based system electricity, we still had great saving for these 2 scenarios. So with respect to economic analysis, we can see economies of scale coming into play. The larger the plant, the more the return would be and lesser the payback period is going to be. And we also found that in case we are having this size distribution, the transportation distance might not change much. It's overall the transportation distance is expected to remain in the same range. So these were a few conclusions that we derived, like there could be a wide distribution in terms of emissions. The chopping could be a better scenario than the briquetting one, and plus we are to gain from economies of scale. The transportation distance, which could look at a major bottleneck or concern, didn't play a major role as far as cost as well as or the emissions are concerned. Then another study that we recently undertook was with respect to energy storage. So as we understand that India is moving towards a net zero energy goal of 2070, and we are aiming for a majority of our energy production to be renewable based at that time. Now if this is going to be renewable based, wind and solar are expected to play a major role in the energy supply. However, these two sources of energy are intermittent in nature, which would mean that we need some kind of energy storage. Further, storage would play a major role in terms of grid stabilization, peak demand management. So the energy demand that we have is not consistent throughout the day. There are certain times of the day when the demand would be much more than others. So how do we manage that? Then the resilience of the grid and also the decarbonization of the grid are something that storage is expected to play a major role. So we consider different types of energy storage options for which we have commercial plants available throughout the world. And the first thing that we talk about storage would come to your mind would be batteries. So lithium-ion batteries are much talked about now. And then there is another sort of battery which is called the vanadium redox flow batteries, which are expected to play a major role at a larger scale. Pump storage is one type of storage that has the major application or major installation throughout the world, and the case is similar for India, where we have now being initiated like many pumped storage sites coming into play. Molten salt storage sites are just a scattered one, like we have one or two sites in India, but we have major application in other part of the world. For compressed air energy storage, we don't have any application in India, but it is expected to play a major role in other parts of the world. So these were the 5 storage systems which are specifically for grid level storage. So I'm not talking about home electricity storage. It's about like the capacity could be normally 250 megawatt or larger. So these are types of scales that I'm talking about, and this is what we try to estimate the sustainability of these kind of storage for the future, which is in terms of economics and both and LC as well. So just to give you a brief, if I am talking about pumped hydro, so this is basically pumping the water from a lower reservoir to a higher reservoir whenever you have extra electricity, and whenever you need whenever you are needing power, you would use the same reservoir for generating electricity through a turbine. Batteries, we all understand, and the concept is electrochemical in nature. Whenever you have extra electricity, you charge the batteries, and whenever you need electricity back, you discharge it. The third option could be molten salt energy storage, wherein you would not need electricity for charging. You would charge the system whenever you have abundant sunlight available. So the sunlight would be used for heating in a molten salt or a similar phase change material, which would remain heated at a higher temperature, which could be normally from 500 to 600 degrees Celsius. And when you are in need of extra electricity, this molten salt could be used for raising in steam, which could be used for raising turbines and producing electricity. This molten salt would eventually be cooled down and heated in the next day. So for such kind of system, you would not need extra charging electricity. So this is charged directly from the excess sunlight that would be available to you. And finally, an option that would be available would be compressed air energy storage, wherein when the extra electricity is available, you would use it to compress air in some kind of underground formation. One particular formation could be salt caverns. There could be empty mines or similar locations where you can pump in this compressed air, and when you need in air, you just pass it through an expander and run generator and produce electricity. So what we try to do is we tried to do an LCA, which was cradle to grave, which means it involved the construction phase of the batteries or the different solar collectors, the use phase wherein you would use electricity for auxiliary processes. So just for an example, the battery packs that we use would have a huge cooling demand, which would need installation of ACs, and these air conditioners would be running on electricity. So there would be an auxiliary demand that goes in the use phase. And finally, you would have the disposal phase, where you would want to dispose of the material that went into the manufacturing of the different storage option. It could be lithium for the batteries, it could be vanadium for the batteries, it could be the solar collectors for the CSP systems, and all this would have emissions during their life cycles. So further, this is a typical system boundary that was considered for a lithium-ion battery systems, where you would have the cells, bars, or the different racks being constructed. So this all went in the manufacturing phase. Then you would have the use phase, where the electricity input goes in. So it includes both the electricity that goes for auxiliary consumption as well as the electricity efficiency that you would have. So if you are charging the batteries with 1000 kilowatt hour of electricity, you won't be able to discharge the same 1000 kilowatt hour. So the discharge would always be lesser, and that is true for any storage option, and that is what is accounted in the use phase as well. And finally, when the use phase is over, you would have the end of life disposal, where you dispose of the different components that went in the manufacturing of a particular storage option. So, and also we consider three different scenarios. So in the first scenario, we considered that the charging is happening through a predominantly solar grid. So for that, like one such grid was available for the country of Belgium, and we adopted the same thing. And this is what we expect a similar condition in the coming few years. So the grid would be predominantly based on renewables. Then in the second was the Indian conventional grid, the grid that we have as of today. And in the third case, we are not considering the footprint of the charging electricity. We are just considering the footprint of electricity that was used for auxiliary processes or the electricity that was lost. So we have just the footprint of the storage. In the first two cases, it also intakes, like the electricity that comes in also has the footprint of that or includes the footprint of the electricity production, how the electricity was produced. Was it produced through renewables, or was it produced through a predominantly fossil based grid. The reason why it is important is because like the efficiency losses could be different for the two cases. If I am having 90% efficiency of a storage option, and if I am having a fossil based grid, the efficiency losses might end up making a bigger concern for the case in which we have a grid that is based on fossil fuels rather than a grid that is based on solar. So the solutions that we or the answers that we got, and herein we use the SimaPro software, and that I believe Ankur has explained to you, and this study itself was done by Ankur, where he tried to estimate the different emissions for the different storage options. So we can estimate the global warming potential of, say, lithium-ion batteries, which turns out to be 162 kgs of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour of electricity stored. And we can also have the ozone depletion potential, the ecotoxicity, acidification, land use that is available. Something similar for molten salt, which comes out to be a bit higher. Then if I consider the pumped hydro, it was found to be the lowest one at around 120. And if I talk about the vanadium redox flow batteries, it had a potential of 190, which happened to be the highest one in this case. Compressed air was somewhere in between at around 160. And we can also do a comparison of the different emission categories and where these emissions are basically coming from. So if I look at the lithium-ion batteries, a majority of the emissions would be coming from the charging electricity, which you see in here. And the construction phase also has a bit of an emissions. The least one comes from the inverter or the disposal one. Further, herein we can see, if I talk about eutrophication, the eutrophication could be a major concern in the construction phase. If I look about the concentrated solar plants, we see electricity does not have a role to play here. Majority of the emissions would be coming from the manufacturing of the solar collectors. So we do not see any electricity playing a role here. If I talk about pumped hydro, again we would have electricity playing a major role, and of course we would have certain emissions coming from the pumped hydro storage itself, because it would entail a land use change. The vegetation that was initially occupying the space where the pumped hydro would have been created might have vegetation being buried, and this vegetation might degrade over the time, causing in the emissions. We can see similar emissions from the vanadium redox flow batteries. In the redox flow batteries, we can see that the manufacturing phase might have significant emissions in terms of ozone depletion, so that might be a bit of a concern. If I talk about the compressed air, electricity again dominates majority of the emissions. So if I look at the comparison in terms of the different scenarios that was considered, we can see pumped hydro coming out to be the least. but the numbers could be very different based upon the type of grid that we are going. If you consider the present grid, the Indian grid at present, the results would be somewhat different. Compressed air, which comes out to be better in here, comes out to be the worst, and the reason I have already explained. Pumped hydro again comes out to be almost the best one in both the scenarios, and the results would be again be somewhat different if I am just considering the emissions that are coming from just the auxiliary consumption, and we are not taking the emissions associated with the incoming electricity. Further, we also did LCOE. We have briefly discussed this part in the economic parts as well, how we would calculate the LCOE. So, we have done the levelized cost of electricity for the 5 different options as well, and this was quite comprehensive. This is something we have discussed in the earlier classes, so I wouldn't go into the detail, but it was basically the average electricity price that I would be paying over the lifespan of the project for the electricity generation. And if I look at the results, this is how the combined result would look like. On the x-axis, you would have the global warming potential of the different storage options. We have 5 options, which is the pumped hydro, the compressed air, lithium-ion batteries, vanadium redox flow batteries, as well as molten salt. So, in terms of GWP, we would have the pumped hydro faring quite good. And then on the y-axis, we would have the levelized cost of storage in terms of rupees per kilowatt hour or rupees per unit of electricity. Again, here we see pumped hydro has is at par with the lowest technologies. So, it's one of the lowest technology that we would have. Pumped hydro, gas, as well as molten salt appear almost having similar price. Batteries, which have been much advertised as an energy storage option, typically have higher storage cost if you are talking about grid scale, and this is one of the reasons why we are not seeing many battery installation as of today, but in the future things might change as the batteries are getting produced on scale. So, again, this is a typical application where the skills that you have learned in terms of LCA and techno-economic analysis can come in very handy, and it could assist the decision makers make meaningful decisions for the future, because if we are going towards a net zero world, we would have to quantify the emission that would come from every part of the life cycle, and we also need to account from the emission that would come from the storage as well. So, this was another case study just to make you understand the application of the tools that we have learned. And with this, I would try to end the course, and I would like to end with a statement that the skills that we have learned, it's not the end, it's not even the beginning of the end, it is perhaps the end of the beginning. There's a whole world for you guys to explore. So, we have just provided you the basic understanding of few things, and it is up to you to explore it. And personally for me, it was a learning experience. In case anyone has any doubts, comments, or any suggestions for the future, please feel free to connect to me on the email. I'll be happy to reply to your queries as and when time allows. And with this, we would like to end the course. Hope it was a learning experience for all of you. Thank you.